as you can see, we did not rehearse that entrance, but here we are, and really delighted to be here and delighted that this morning starts off with a discussion about the role of the states. I have been a champion of states' action on all kinds of things, but particularly climate, for quite a long time now, and I'm delighted to be accompanied here by two current active participants in the effort to move ahead. And I'm also really pleased that at a time when state action is increasingly necessary, we are seeing leaders at the state level coming to the fore and once again picking up the slack where the federal government is leaving off. It's a different time than we've faced before. I go back in terms of my work on climate to the Clinton administration, where despite the fact that we were successful in helping to get the Kyoto Accord adopted at the UN, the United States never ratified that accord. And so it was left to those of us who wanted to see it move forward and to recognize the severity of the problem, to figure out ways to actually create programs and implement programs that would help achieve the results that were called for. And I'm proud of the successes that we had. Today, we're in an even more dire situation where it isn't just a question of the US Senate not being willing to sign on to some international accord, but really our entire administration at the top level committed to rolling back every vestige of action that has been taken over decades now. So it's a more challenging time even than we faced when I was running the California Air program and had the responsibility of carrying out our climate agenda in the first Trump administration. I think all of you who are here, and I've seen and met quite a few people in the last day or so who are actually working in the field, doing all the important things that actually can store or reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And you know better than I do what the impacts are of cutbacks of people, uncertainties about who's going to be staffing programs in the future and whether there's going to be any funding available to even continue with contracts that were already in place to do good work. So I'm not going to dwell on any of that, but rather try to turn to my colleagues here and ask them to give us a little bit more in the way of detail about how they're addressing the climate program at their own working levels. And so I'm going to start this morning because he's on the video screen, and that's always a little bit awkward when you're not in the room, but you look great, you know, the color balance is perfect, and hopefully the sound is working as well. And so I am going to start off by calling on the Commerce Director for the state of Washington, Joe Nguyen, who was born and raised in Seattle. His experiences as a Washington resident and a second-generation Vietnamese American make him an ardent champion for investing in Washington's families and residents, expanding economic opportunities, and taking bold steps in our fight against climate crisis. He was appointed by Governor Bob Ferguson to his job as Commerce Director on December 27th, 2024, and he took the helm at Commerce on January 15th of 2025. So he's only been at his job a little under a year. Before that, he was a state senator, so an elected official from 2019 to 2024. And in the Senate, he chaired the Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee and supported legislation that dealt with affordable housing, healthcare, public transit, education and climate, the subject of our conference here. He's a longtime advocate for working families and community members. I think what I would just want to stress here is that he also has a background working in the private sector. He worked for both Expedia and Microsoft, and he's been a volunteer with organizations that worked at the community level, and including problems like homelessness and law enforcement oversight, all of which are equally, for most of us, present on a day-to-day basis, in addition to the work that we're doing to try to help our planet. And so I think, given that background, he has a unique ability to see the interrelationships between these topic areas and how a climate program can and maybe even must bring those issues together and bring people together in communities where, until you have a fire or a flood or other natural disaster which is directly linked to a changing climate, this may not be your top of mind agenda at all times in the political world. And we've seen this over and over again, that people now, nobody actually, even at the most extreme, believes that scientists are lying about climate change or whether it's happening or not. What they argue about is whether it's possible to do anything about it that doesn't otherwise destroy our way of life. So I want to start by asking you, Joe, to talk a little bit about how, in your role as a public official, you go about trying to make these issues real for your constituents in Washington State.
Well, first off, thank you so much for the incredibly warm welcome. I really appreciate it. And apologies for not being there in person. We're in the middle of our legislative cycle right now, so I wasn't able to sneak down to California. And first off, thank you so much for even having this conversation. Washington State, candidly, under the guidance of our former governor, Governor Jay Inslee, has been a tremendous leader in this space. And I'll be honest, if not for him and his leadership, we would not be as far as we are right now. And we're uniquely positioned to move forward as well in this space. I was actually at COP29 in Baku over the past summer, and it was right after the election. And obviously that was kind of the talk of the town, was how do we move forward as subnationals given what's happening at the federal level? So we've been engaged in that place as well. But I will probably be less doom and gloom than I think most folks, because I think that there's so much that we can actually do right now, agnostic of what's happening at the federal level. And for me, I say that knowing that I have a state where we passed what's called the Climate Commitment Act. It is a cap and invest program where we basically cap the amount of pollution, and there's credits associated with it. That generates about $2 billion in revenue over the last biennium, where I was the chief architect being able to allocate some of those resources. We also have the Clean Energy Transformation Act. We also have one of the most progressive transportation budgets in Washington State history, probably in the nation as well when it comes to electrification. We have a low carbon fuel standards. And we also have a population here in Washington State that ardently believes in decarbonizing. A lot of our work was put on the ballot this past cycle by some conservative individuals who do not, I don't believe in the effects of climate change. And we actually won. So the climate change policies were defended by a 62% margin. So that gives us a lot of ability to move forward. So my point in that is that not only is climate policy important for our future, it's actually very politically popular as well within jurisdictions. In 7 counties that voted for Trump in Washington State, they actually voted to support climate policies at the same time. That was an interesting dynamic that we saw. And some of the work that I think that we can continue to do is really addressing the historical harms of what has happened in our state, where a lot of the investments that we make are not so much focused on just the infrastructure or decarbonization. It's how do you engage the people who were impacted historically and bring them along at the same time. Our Cap and Invest program, that 35% of that $2 billion has to go through overburdened communities. It has to go to apprenticeship programs. It has to go to transitions. Our tribes are engaged. Part of how we're able to keep moving forward, despite maybe some issues that we have at the federal level is that we have this broad coalition of individuals who are part of it. So I think my high-level abstract is when you include individuals who are impacted, when you include communities who are impacted, that makes the work a little bit easier. And because of that, we've been able to invest in things like infrastructure for transmission lines. We have free transit for young people across Washington State. We have a number of rebates as it relates to EV infrastructure. We have energy rebates for those who are most impacted. This is the first year in Washington State that we didn't have major wildfires. We're using technology and we're using science to actually help mitigate the worst of those impacts as well. And we have kind of this, unique ability for us in Washington State because we have access to hydroelectricity to leverage that to deploy other technologies. So we're seeing a lot of battery infrastructure and companies that come here because we've invested in what's called test beds, right? So from an economic development perspective, there are things that we can do right now that as we lay the groundwork and see how the federal level plays out, will position us for success. And that includes working with, California, Quebec. We're one of 3 jurisdictions that have this carbon market. And if we link together, we're actually stronger as well. So that's just kind of a high-level preview in terms of what we're doing here in Washington State. But I think that given the amount of work and all that we have to actually accomplish, there's a lot that we need to do in the next 2 to 4 years anyway that hopefully will position us, in the near future where we have a federal administration that is more sympathetic towards some of this action, that we can position ourselves very well.
Thanks. I'm going to do a quick round for all of the speakers up here before I get into more direct interaction, but I'm going to turn next to Justin Johnson, who, once he begins to speak, you will immediately recognize as a Vermonter. I'm joking. He'll tell you a little bit more about his background, I'm sure. But like me, Justin is a former commissioner of his state's Environmental Conservation Department. He's been a deputy secretary of administration. He served as chief of staff for a member of the Australian Federal Parliament. And he served on the board of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is another pioneering market-based program for addressing greenhouse gas emissions. He has a background in journalism, which is extremely useful in this kind of work. And he lives currently in central Vermont. So Vermont and California have been allies for many years in air and climate work. Certainly, from my personal experience, Vermont is a very small state that does not have a huge, as far as I know at least, fund available to support the climate action work that they do. They're known for being thrifty, but also being tough on regulation. And like a number of jurisdictions that we're seeing around the world, sometimes when you attack a state like Vermont, you find out that they fight back. And this proved itself to be true back in the days when a federal administration long ago was fighting alongside the auto industry against California's rules, which we call the Pavley rules, because of Senator Fran Pavley, who was their original author, that required auto companies to use whatever technology they needed to use in order to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases from passenger cars and light trucks. And Vermont adopted the California rules and then proceeded to have to be the lead defendant to keep those rules in effect. So aside from all the other lovely things about Vermont, like autumn leaves and cheese and stuff like that, Vermont has a particular place in my affection among all of our states. So Justin, I'm going to now give you a chance to talk a little bit about how Vermont has gone about both gathering the political consensus and the ability to move forward on climate and what you view as some of the most important things that the state is doing.
Well, thank you, Mary. I remember those days well. I don't know, maybe I'm starting to get old or something, but I remember that. It was really interesting that, when the case was first filed, it was a group of Ford dealerships, as I remember it, that filed the case against the state of Vermont. We had one staff attorney in the AIR program, and we had the Attorney General's office, and that was it. But, really in terms of the technical folks to sort of fight that, we had the staff attorney and 3 people in the AIR program, and got to know a lot of people from California very quickly in the period immediately after that lawsuit. It was over a year-long process, but we were successful. I think it's notable because I think it's really relevant to today. So we're talking about the state's role and what the future looks like. I think it was a real eye-opener to me back in 2004, 2005, when I was at the Environmental Conservation Department in Vermont, to travel particularly to Europe and meet with folks, and they were always completely stunned that a state with 645,000 people would be able as in allowed, to do anything. And part of that, I think, goes to sort of the state's position in the structure of the country, and the fact that states do have real roles and real responsibilities and obligations, and they take them seriously. I mean, clearly the federal government also plays a huge role in these things, and I'll get to that a little bit in a moment, but the states were always imagined, from my understanding and from my experience, to actually play a role in these things. And so I think when I look to the future, it's a sort of a positive thing in the sense that is the case today, will remain so in the future. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I think got underway like 6 months before the California program. At the time, we're very proud to say we're the first in North America. We had to scramble to stay ahead of California a little bit there. Of course, it wasn't really fair because you were doing a whole economy approach and we were just doing electric generation. So that was a bit easy, although you did have 10 states that all had to come together and agree on something, which is sort of mind-blowing that could even happen. And as I think we're sort of seeing at the moment, as Reggie goes through a program review process that has taken a lot longer than most of us expected, it's no mean feat to get all of those states sort of to agree on something and agree on it in the right time frame to actually move it forward. So that process is underway and it continues on. And I think that it's become incredibly important, because if it wasn't obvious before, and I actually think it was, the action on climate change in the US is going to happen at the state level. We have not really seen, since the collapse of the sort of Wax and Markey approach, and we haven't seen really any evidence that the federal government is going to take this up, particularly a market-based program. So I think that despite some of the big headlines lately, none of the fundamentals have really changed. The states have the authority, they have the an obligation, an expectation from their constituents to move these things forward. Ideally, they work together a little bit, because particularly in a small state, the first thing that people always say, the naysayers in Vermont will say is, well, 645,000 people, what could you possibly do that would make any difference? It's perhaps a true statement, but it's also terrible logic. We could all say, I can't do anything, and then we all do nothing, and suddenly 8 billion people are doing nothing, and nothing happens. And it just doesn't work that way. So, the collective action that the states bring, the ability to test things and try things out, I think is really important and will continue to be so. Reggie itself was originally supposed to be a somewhat temporary sort of pilot program. It was a little bit to show what was possible. we fully expected, at Reggie board meetings, we talked about what we could get done before the program got taken over by whatever came out of Waxman-Markey. We were thinking it was only going to last, 2 years, maybe 4 at the longest, and then we'd all be under a federal program. And we spent a lot of time worrying about whether, that our number one goal was to make sure that a Reggie allowance would be worth 100% in the federal program. Now, how that fits with using short tons is another story, but so I think the important thing though is that none of the things that we went through back then have actually changed. There's a lot of noise in the system. Clearly there's challenges ahead. The road has never been straight, but I think the state's ability to work together and to try things out remains as it was. And I think that, it's not going to be easy, but we can absolutely do it. I remember spending, every 6 months or so, a group of states. At the time, at its height, you had Reggie, the Midwest Governors Climate Accord states. You had the Western Climate Initiative states. You had some Canadian provinces. We'd all get together in Washington and say, we could link all these together. We could link them, and it's going to be great. We don't, Waxman-Markey's gone away, but we can recreate that ourselves, And here we are 15, 18 years later, and we're not there yet, but we still talk about these things. And I think that, the states will, particularly the Northeast states who are used to working together, will continue to work on this. I'll just finish up this bit because I know there's a lot to get through, but both Vermont and Maryland are in the process of sort of looking at the New York Cap and Invest program, the Western Climate Initiative program, to sort of trying to work out where they might fit in that. So the work is ongoing, and I think that, what we've learned in the last, since November is that the states are going to have to be at the forefront of that work going forward.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Rajinder Sahota, who has been the Deputy Executive Officer in charge of the climate change and research programs at CARB, California Air Resources Board, since 2021. And she's responsible, therefore, for directing scientific activities around planning for our implementation of the state's comprehensive climate law. I'm not going to read a whole lot more of her bio for you because it's extensive and impressive. So you can look her up if you want to. But one of the things that I noticed that she proudly continues to keep on her official bio and hasn't scrubbed yet from any place that I know is that she was the inaugural co-chair of CARB's Diversity and Racial Equity Task Force, a position which really helped to create an internal effort at the Air Resources Board to have our own activities and our own human resources reflect the diversity of the state that we live in. And I bring that up only really because it's an important fact that one of the things that gave California the will and the commitment, the ability to commit to having a comprehensive climate program was the fact that we have this incredibly diverse state full of people who come here to do research, to start companies, and to participate in a global economy. And so California's climate action law, which was passed in 2006 and which I had the honor of leading from 2007 under Governor Schwarzenegger, who is, of course, himself a proud immigrant, is that the muscle, the lobbying effort that got that bill passed came from Silicon Valley people, many of whom were originally from somewhere else, who saw the opportunity of being leaders and being ahead of the curve as something that they thought California could do when the federal government was stalled and having difficulty, as it generally does, in getting together the momentum to act on climate, that California, as a big economy with a mixed economy, could make progress on a global problem, and they would also gain the advantage as investors and entrepreneurs of being first movers. Now, this didn't work quite as fast or as widely as they hoped either, but nevertheless, they defended the program and were a big part of helping to continue to support it when it was under attack. And we'll talk later about what some of those attacks look like. But I want to now ask Rajinder, who's in the midst of leading another effort to continue California's climate programs, to talk a little bit about what it's like around CARB these days when you're dealing with what seems to be an even more frontal attack on the state's ability to act than we've seen in the past.
Thanks, Mary, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. And thank you to NACW. Congratulations on your retirement, Craig, and congratulations on your new job, Robin. And also thank you, because this is the first time Mary Nichols and I have ever shared a stage together. I have never moderated a panel with Mary on it. This is the first time she's moderating a panel where I'm on it, because either she is on a panel or I am on a panel from her tenure at CARB. So it's a hallmark for me to be able to sit here on the stage with Mary Nichols. But I think it's important to think about California's story and how it began, and then how it's going to move forward. Because not only do we have the former chair here with Mary Nichols, but we also have the current chair, Leanne Randolph, here, who's going to do a keynote after this plenary. So in 2006, AB 32 was signed into law. Under Mary Nichols, we launched the cap and trade program. We launched the low carbon fuel standard, SF6 regulations, oil and gas regulations, landfill regulations, and refrigerant regulations. So a whole suite of programs were designed and implemented in a short amount of time in California. Those programs still persist. And it wasn't just these programs that were launched that have a long history in the state now. They've been picked up in other states as well, or used as models in other regions. But it's also the people that worked on these programs. And I think this speaks to the passion that we have just as Californians in the work that we do to protect the environment and public health. You're going to hear from many people that worked at CARB or still work at CARB on these programs. Folks like Richard Corey, Virgil Welch, Emily Wimberger, Sarah Eisent, and then also folks like Mark Cipolla, Jason Gray, and Adam Moreno, who in their all way are continuing to do this work, either at CARB or in other spaces, advancing the things that we started at CARB. So that's a great story. That is an amazing story. And as we think about moving forward, and we think about the challenges ahead, as you put it politely, I have other words for it, we're very fortunate to have Chair Leanne Randolph. She is going to be ready and able and in the front to help lead the defense of California's air quality and climate programs. And she's not going to be alone. We have a governor who's going to co-chair America's All In. And she has an agency of about 2,000 engineers, scientists, and attorneys ready to support this effort that she will be leading. And I have every reason to believe that career public servants like Leanne, like Mary, and some of us are going to be here to persist and to make sure that we do everything we can to keep the eye on the ball in terms of reducing emissions and making sure that we have a sustainable future. So there's the hope. We've been here for almost 20 years. We're going to continue to be here. We're going to be strategic. We're going to be creative. Things that look like roadblocks are going to become detours by the time we're done with them. But we're going to keep moving in the direction we're meant to be moving in, and that is to move away from the combustion of fossil fuels and move towards cleaner air and making sure that others see us and continue to partner with us as they look at programs and policies to reduce emissions. So what does it feel like to be inside CARB? It's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people that think we should be out there protesting or making more noise publicly about how we will defend California, and we are the opposite of what's happening on the East Coast, and look to us. But there's a time and a place to pick up a picket sign or protest sign, and there is a place to be strategic, to put your head down, do the good work, build the relationships, work with industry, reach across the aisle with like-minded people, and keep making progress. And I think that's part of what we're trying to make sure that our staff understands. When something like what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. happens, everybody wants to scream and say, no, this has to stop, this can't be what's happening. But we need to funnel all of that emotion into actual work. And so our job within CARB is to figure out how we as a senior leadership team keep our staff focused and recognize that there is chaos, there is uncertainty, but we have programs, we have policies, we have statutes, we have executive orders that we are going to be able to implement because we have authority over greenhouse gases at the state level. And so even within CARB, we face uncertainty in terms of, what does it mean for our air pollution programs where it's under US EPA for our state implementation plans, for meeting our air quality standards? What does it mean for our climate when our transportation programs are under attack? What it means is we're gonna have to sit down and think through and be creative again, like we've done in the past, to make sure that we keep reducing emissions and keep moving this forward. The partnerships are gonna be critical. And I think that's something, as regulators, it takes getting used to. There's this ideal that as a regulator, you're at arm's length, you're on the side, everybody else is on the other side because they're the people that are putting out the emissions. But I think in times like this, there's an opportunity to actually have conversations, listen to each other, and find a path forward. It may not be the path forward that you thought you were going to have with a regulation, but it's still a path forward, and that's still progress. And what I said yesterday was that progress can be delayed, but it can't be stopped. And I think that's true on all fronts: social justice, environmental justice, all fronts, including the environment. And I think that's on us as the senior leadership at CARB to make sure that our staff get to actually talk to many of you, know what you're doing in this space, know that there's interest and there's investment potential out there, but also make sure that they have the support to be able to do the work they need to do, and understand that progress, any progress, is going to be great progress at this time.
Thanks. Since this is a conference that certainly is focused on market-based programs and the idea of carbon markets and how they can help provide the financing that's essential to make the transition away from a carbon-based economy, let's talk a little bit more about the design and what we've learned over the years that we've been launching these programs. None of them were easy to implement, to design or get into effect. As Justin mentioned earlier with Reggie, it involved several states, 7, is it? Northeast? 10 Northeast states, sorry, that came together and became part of a market focusing on the electricity sector, which, by the way, if you look at the economy of the United States by sectors, is clearly the leader in terms of decarbonization. We've made more progress there than we have anywhere else. It's really remarkable that more to come and more to do globally, especially in the developing world. But we've seen how we can mobilize technology and policy to actually show that you can reduce emissions and create a very successful, vibrant world of renewable energy. States are individual entities, each with its own CEO and legislature and court system. So a little bit the models in the case of the eastern states that were followed when the United States came together to become a country. And they differ in many ways, but they all share, I think, a fierce commitment to their own independence and their own ability to act when they see problems that they can address themselves. And they also do what one of my fellow state environmental leaders once said: they brag, borrow, and steal from each other on a very regular basis. And when they get together, that's one of the things they talk about, is how great they are. And by the way, what are you doing? And then they take it and they modify it, and in many cases make it better based on what happened before. And they go on. And this is a dynamic which effectively makes progress overall. So I want to get back to you, excuse me, Joe, and talk a little bit about the Cap and Invest program in Washington, because you followed in California's wake, but you did some things a little bit differently that were Washington oriented. One of which was very smart, was to call it Cap and Invest instead of Cap and Trade, because that conveyed a whole different image to the public, which was extremely helpful when you were faced, as we were when we launched our program, with a ballot initiative to try to stop the program. But talk a little bit more about what you saw as you watched California's program unfold, and how you were able to kind of repackage that in a way that would work for your state.
Yeah, first off, I completely agree with the concept of brag and borrow. I call it case, copy, and steal everything, because I'd rather learn from other jurisdictions as we refine our process. You know, AB 32, as passed, was about 13 pages. And it was a model that we definitely followed. Ours was the Climate Commitment Act in 2021, was a little over 60 pages as well. And most of that was actually on the investment side. When you look at climate policies, oftentimes we get stuck in this abstract where we keep it existential. It's a climate threat, it's a climate policy, it's a climate, people don't understand what that looks like in their day-to-day. The vast majority of the Climate Commitment Act we passed in Washington State, like I said, was just overwhelmingly approved by 62% of Washingtonians, is the investments that it makes, within our communities as well. When you get to a point of loss aversion, if people start to understand how this actually impacts their lives, that narrative shifts. Again, this was one of the first years in the last 10 years in Washington State where we didn't have major wildfires. A lot of it was because of investments from the Climate Commitment Act to mitigate some of the issues that we've seen in the past. A lot of the technology and infrastructure we're seeing that our communities are benefiting from are from the Climate Commitment Act. So we had this whole campaign around the investments that were made. And the reason why we had that campaign was because the policies were passed specifically with that in mind. 30% of the revenue associated with the Cap and Invest program in Washington State has to go through overburdened communities. 15% has to go through our tribal partners as well. And we co-create what that looks like through what's called the HEAL Act. It's the Environmental Justice Committee that we have associated with this. So that was just as important as the technical details associated with it, which is still there. And I'll say one of my last bills that I had was for us to link potentially with California and Quebec. We're certainly in conversations that are happening now. So we are keeping mind of kind of the global implications of that work, but you have to focus on who's going to be impacted, because at the end of the day, you know, they have to be brought on board, or else your policies may sound great, but if you can't do it, there's no point.
Thanks. So, Justin, do you want to talk a little bit about how RGGI has evolved over time with all these various issues that the different states have, including elections in which the parties have changed over the years and states have withdrawn or come back? How do you keep on keeping on?
Yeah. It's interesting. It really was, I think at the beginning, it felt like a sort of a club. You know, it was a group of people that were going to work this out no matter what. They spent a lot of time between 2004 and the first auction in 2009, just working this over, trying to, you know, talking to California and the Western Climate Initiative states, looking at what was happening with the European ETS. You know, there are a couple things that seem so ridiculously simple today that felt like big decisions at the time. So for instance, we decided early on that Reggie allowances would be treated like a financial instrument, like they had real value, which was a mistake the Europeans had made. I've described it before as, they sort of thought of these allowances like family photos, worth a lot to you, but no one else would care. But it turns out they had real value, and as soon as you have real value, there's the opportunity for shenanigans, and the Europeans had some serious problems with that. So we learned from that. We also, and the state spent a ton of time thinking this through. And I will say somewhat proudly that Vermont pushed very hard for a percentage of the revenue to be used for public good. As it turns out, almost all of the Reggie states have used almost all of the money for those broader sort of mitigation public good projects. Not in every case. A couple of states have put the money in the general fund at different times, but as a concept, we agreed in the original model rule that at least 75% of the money would go for public good. And I think that, as big of a decision that seemed to be at the time, it's something that people expect now. It's like you would be very hard pressed to do anything else. Then, there are other just straight up logistical things, like we spent a lot of time trying to work out what sort of auction we would have, whether it be like an English auction where you start low and go high, or a Dutch auction where you start high and go low, or a closed tender, or something like that. It was, there was a lot of just really basic stuff that we had to work out. And one of the things we learned along the way, which was a bit of a revelation for all of us regulators sitting in the room, was, we wanted a market-based program. Republican Governor George Pataki in New York said, was big on this. New York would join if it was a market-based program because he wanted the market involved. And we spent a lot of time talking about it until we decided that as a bunch of government bureaucrats, regulators, we were probably not the right people to design a market because we didn't actually do markets. And so we were able to get some help on that. And I think ever since then, things around cost containment and the emissions containment reserve that was added in the program, I think it was the last program review, although it seems a long time ago now. It's been an evolution as we move forward. New Jersey left, but they came back. We've had the ongoing saga of Pennsylvania and Virginia. There's certainly people who see the benefit of being in the program. But I think through all of that, we have tried to make sure that the program was robust, it was transparent, it was clear, why it was there, where the money was going, and to run it as a real market as much as we could. And so I think that has held firm all the way through, and I think we'll continue to make Reggie successful. Coming on 14 years old, it feels like it's a part of the family now, but anything can happen. And so I think the team of people who are looking at it now, I would hope that they recognize what a precious thing they have, and they really work to keep those fundamentals in place.
Thanks. One of the amazing things about our regulatory system in California, and it's really true in other places, that over the years, partly as a result of shifting political tides, partly as a result of economists and people from the financial community, business community, who've beaten up on us regulators and said you could do things that would be more efficient and more effective than the kinds of regulations that you're writing, and you should really think about how to do that. The fact is that most regulations that are coming out nowadays have some kind of a market element in them. It's just it's assumed that we will do that. And it's also true that the idea of markets is still anathema to some in our communities who believe that it's a sign that we're not really serious, we're not willing to fight for what we believe, as Rajinder alluded to earlier, that they want there to be more confrontation rather than less. Confrontation creates a lot of wasted energy and is a diversion much of the time, which doesn't mean you don't have to be able to do it. That's why we have 3 branches of government after all, because we know that, and our founding fathers knew that people weren't always going to agree with each other about how to move forward and who should do it. But the idea that we can find ways to actually use incentives of various kinds to achieve the kind of results that we would all like to see policies achieve is, I think, pretty well embedded now in the thinking of pretty much every level of government. But California is once again looking at updating its programs and figuring out, how the market can continue to succeed in a situation where suddenly, when part of the original design was never for it to be a big generator of funds for the state. In fact, it has generated billions of dollars, which are very much needed in times of budget crisis. And the legislature is going to have to face up to the question of how they're going to bind themselves going forward in terms of how the proceeds from this program will be invested. So is this something that people are actively talking about right now? And do you see this as an area which could potentially be either the solution or the obstacle to the program?
So the money was not important when we first did the program because nobody realized how much money could be generated, or it would be something that could be available to the legislature as part of the budgeting process. Over the last 13 years, it's become very obvious that the money is a side product of the program. It's not the primary part. But because it's such a huge part, we still run into parts of the conversation where people don't realize there's an entire regulatory program sitting behind the money. Mm-hmm. The money just shows up, and that is the cap and trade program, not the part with the compliance obligations to the emissions, not the part where people are having to make a decision to invest in clean technology, none of those pieces. And so I think this time there is a very big conversation about the money. And I think it's triggered by the fact that the legislative body has changed since some of the money was locked in AB 398 process in 2016 and 17. We've had budget constraints happen last year, this year, and they may happen again. And so looking at that sort of money or that source of money is very important, just in overall balancing the budget, but also making sure that we fund priorities such as efforts to close the disparities between the frontline communities and non-frontline communities. And so when in the appropriation process, we have a similar statutory requirement of at least 35% of the appropriations must be in those communities, those frontline communities. And then an additional percent, I think it's up to 25, that must benefit those communities. In reality, we've been appropriating over 70% of the money back into these communities. There's also money going straight into the climate credit, which shows up on energy bills twice a year, gas and utility. And I think that story about how it's being recycled back has somehow gotten lost in all of the conversation. The money just shows up. I get to give you a grant. I get to get some money off of my bill. But where does it come from and why is that program there? I think some of that has definitely gotten lost. But I think there is a very big and intentional effort this time to make sure that folks understand it's this program, the market trading program, and the design of it that enables that money to be available. And I think for the members of the legislature, it's a tough decision because there's a lot of priorities and there's never enough money about how that money should be spent. And I actually think that there'll be quite a bit of active conversation about some of the continuous appropriations that we've had. And is there a way to not keep binding themselves for years or decades until there's this kind of effort to revisit some of that continuous appropriation? And there's also the conversation about, the community protection program, AB 617, that was passed alongside with the cap and trade extension in 2016-17, should there be continuous appropriations for that program so there's a sense of, or less anxiety about being able to provide those tools and those efforts at the community level where people have more say and a seat at the table in what they're feeling in terms of emissions, how they feel like they should be addressed, and what are the important things to be addressed. So all of that is going to be part of the conversation. I think I want to go back to one of the earlier points you made, Mary, which was, these programs are becoming more and more evident in the design about a trading mechanism, some kind of incentive mechanism. The cap and trade program has been thought about and debated over and over and over again in California, and we have our scoping plan. And we get to look at our suite of policies, the progress we've made to date, and what we need to do to keep moving forward for the next set of targets. In 2 successive scoping plans, the cap and trade program comes up as the most cost-effective, or as the chair, Leanne Randolph, would say, the cost-conscious program in terms of closing that gap and helping us meet the statutes. And so it's not just about the money it raises for these other efforts, it's the money it saves as we draw down emissions. And I think those are both big stories in what an emissions trading program looks like.
There's definitely a continuing need for communication, education, and consensus building about how these programs work and what they're for. And I suspect that it's always hard to gather the public's attention around these somewhat technical sounding issues, no matter what's going on, but especially now that we're in a situation where the news is just coming at us constantly, and it's one exciting or outrageous thing after another. Something like climate change, which requires a little bit more nuanced analysis of the arguments, is going to be a continuing effort for everybody to explain to their friends, neighbors, constituents, et cetera. I now have the opportunity to open up this conversation to the people in the audience. You can address a question at any one of us, or it could be a more general question that we could all perhaps want to weigh in on. But I'm ready to hear from you, because there's a lot of people here in the audience who know a lot and think a lot about these topics. I see a couple closer hands.
Oh, I have one here. Hi, everyone. Hope Raymond from Quantum Commodity Intelligence. I'm just interested on your perspective on how the federal administration, UC, will kind of react to the states in continuing initiatives and pushing for climate policy under his kind of current administration.
I'm going to need help, I think, because of the microphone.
How states see implications of federal action towards them as they continue to pursue climate action.
Whether the states feel threatened by what the federal government is actually doing, is that really the question? Well, I think we could all probably speak to that. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the state of California, because there are other people here to do that. But I've been in several meetings in the last months with representatives of the NGO community, as well as people from states who are deeply involved in all of this work. And I think they all feel concerned about the implications of the barrage of activities that are aimed at overturning or undermining the regulatory system at the state level. There's already lots of litigation being brought by attorneys general to resist some of those efforts. This was something that happened in the first Trump administration. Actually, it even happened a few times under George Bush's administration, George W. Bush's administration. So, California, on its own behalf, and as a centerpiece of a number of other states that follow our vehicle emissions programs, has litigated many times in order to maintain the authority that it had under the Federal Clean Air Act, that it enjoys under the Federal Clean Air Act, and is used very effectively to reduce air pollution in our state, and now increasingly to play a role in reducing greenhouse gases as well. But I'm going to ask the other members of this panel if they have any kind of specific issues that they've seen coming, which they're focusing on making sure that they either have an answer for or a way of getting around what you see happening at the federal level. Do you want to comment, Joe?
Yeah, no, first off, great question. I think the biggest risk that we see largely is going to be on the federal funding for some of this work. And kind of to spin it a little bit, I spent the weekend, there's a podcast that I follow, and they happened to interview the cabinet members in the Trump administration. And I was, a glutton for punishment, and I was driving a long distance. So I listened to this podcast. And the topic of energy dominance came up multiple times amongst many of the different cabinet members. So there is already a perspective around energy in the United States. It may not be in the same traditional sense that we think of it in terms of decarbonization, but I do see paths. And one of the ways that we're looking at it in Washington State specifically is that, this, depending on how you look at it, is a 2 to 4 year issue in terms of kind of this climate around decarbonization and climate change. So I certainly know that there's more than 2 to 4 years worth of work when it comes to permitting and siting and transmission and community development and supply chain that we have to do. So it's a matter of us preparing Washington State in a way that we know we have to address anyways. We're likely going to go this route versus this route first to kind of ensure that we keep moving as we kind of prepare. But, I was actually tempted to reach out to the administration federal level around some of the comments they made, because there are things that Washington State is doing around supply chain or even nuclear that they may be interested in, that we can move forward, even if that wasn't necessarily our focus previously.
From the very beginning of action taking place around the United States on climate, energy has been the focus, and specifically where you stand as a state depends on what your fuel sources are. Where does your electricity come from? Are you a coal state? Are you an oil state? Are you a state that has wind and solar? And it's made a big difference. It's not entirely determinative, because, for example, Texas has become the biggest user of wind energy of all the states, and yet politically they certainly have not been in the forefront of advocacy around climate. But in general, there is an overlap between how people see their energy future and what they hope to see going forward. And as I alluded to before when I commented on how the electricity sector has really led the way in terms of being able to demonstrate that you can decarbonize a hugely important sector of the economy, the changes that have been made, although they are certainly pushed and promoted by policy, are now very much embedded in the economy. Do you see a shift in terms of the attitude of the Northeast states and the Reggie states because of the federal now announced policy in terms of promoting more oil and gas?
Yeah, I think, certainly for a state like Vermont, where emissions from electric generation are something less than 2% of emissions. Now, it gets complicated because a lot of that is because of Hydro-Quebec in Canada, and so we're particularly interested in any conversations around tariffs and what that might mean. But I think to the sort of heart of the question, I think the Northeast states, at least at this time, in my sort of estimation, are not as worried about sort of punishment from the federal government because of the actions they're taking as they are, and I'll go back to Joe's point, about the impacts of the federal decisions on state budgets. Vermont is a really small state, as is Wyoming, Montana, states like that. They get a lot of money from the federal government. 35% of Vermont's budgeted money is federal money. It doesn't take a lot of changes in Washington to create a really big problem, because that's direct money to the state. There is also things like the NEVI grants, the electric vehicle infrastructure grants, which essentially have stopped. That money may not come to the state as an entity, but it goes to businesses in the state to do work in the state. And of course, whenever that happens, a state collects either sales tax, income tax, some other, they're skimming off all of those dollars that are floating around in the system. And so I think the immediate nervousness is around budgetary impacts, not so much that the federal government would come after a state because of its policies, although we see a little bit of that from time to time. But right now, the Northeast states are all in the middle of writing their budgets for 2027, for fiscal 2027, and they're all really worried about the uncertainty of what is going to be coming ultimately from the federal government and how to write that into their budget documents.
Yeah. So as was alluded to earlier, California is facing huge liabilities because of the fires that hit Southern California in January. We have an annual issue about filling the budget gap for firefighting in the state. This is the first time that the size of this has exploded to the extent that it has, because the damage was to some very valuable property in Southern California, in addition to the lives that were taken and were disrupted. The firefighting itself is enormously expensive. And California is used to having the governor make disaster proclamations and then having the federal government come in and help. This time the federal government did come and help early on and in an important way, sending in resources from FEMA and from EPA in terms of clearing toxic waste, and from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But they're on a very short time schedule. They had to complete their work on a fixed deadline, and there are still big questions about federal support for the recovery efforts. I think it's fair to say, Rajinder, that the governor of California is in a tough place, because he has been very strong as a defender of climate action, of California's programs, all of our unique efforts on air pollution, water pollution, et cetera, pioneering role, our global role, and at the same time he has to recognize that the money will not flow unless the federal government decides that it's going to do so. So I'm interested to know how this plays into your thinking, if it does, or what you're hearing really around the state in terms of how you interact with your federal colleagues.
Well, the first thing is, who do you call? Because many federal employees are not there, which is just a tragedy unto itself. Because you need these services, you need these folks in those positions to actually be able to help organize and collaborate across different states and regions in this country. So we've already got an issue at the federal level with not knowing who to go to, or will there be enough support to help organize and navigate some of these issues. But I think that I agree with Joe, where we have alignment on things that are coming out of Washington, D.C., we should align and keep those pieces going. And then when there are areas where it looks like a roadblock, we should be creative. And this is things like the Stellantis deal, the automaker deal that we made in the first Trump administration, which were made at CARB, not at the governor's office. And so there's a role for where the governor can sit and how he interacts with the federal conversation. And there's a role where state agencies can sit and do that same discussion and interaction. But also, we can go and not have to do a government kind of approach. We can actually talk to industry, be creative, and come up with a different way to do this. And if we are able to bring on more partner states as part of that, it actually is beneficial to industry to actually have a bigger market to sell to and a consistency in their product lines. And so I think there's a role that can be there for both what's happening at the federal level. It's ugly what's happening at the federal level. The fact that there was contingency on these funds we'd never seen before was just not helpful, was just unbelievable to use this tragedy as a place to do that kind of, that stance. But I think there's different levels, there's different places where we can actually circumvent and find creative ways to keep moving on areas where we don't even align.
And it's in everybody's interest to be as nimble about these things as possible, because you just don't know what's going to come next. That seems to be the lesson of the last couple of months. Next question.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. I'm Jessica Dell with Argus Media. Thank you all for the talk. My question is for Rajinder. I know that CARB has a lot on its plate this year between cap and trade and LCFS and other programs. So I was wondering if you could speak to the probable timing of the resubmission to OAL of the LCFS rulemaking and when those tougher targets, amongst other things, could be implemented. Thanks.
So that's just for you, I guess.
Yes. Unless somebody else got a disapproval from OAL. I didn't find out about it. This is my first and only disapproval for a regulation at CARB, so I will be framing the actual signed document because it's the only one we're ever going to get in my portfolio. We're trying to get through the LCFS regulation update, addressing the maze, the clarity that was flagged by OAL as quickly as possible. We get 120 days. We don't want to take 120 days. Again, we know that investments need certainty, so we want to work through that as quickly as possible. And so don't expect us to take 120 days. Expect us to move as quickly as we can there. In terms of the cap and trade program and tougher targets there, we're still working through the amendments. There's incoming information about some new modeling related to the energy side that we want to make sure that we're tapping into and incorporating. And then also thinking through the affordability concerns out there and figuring out, are there things that we could do in a slightly different way to make sure that we're addressing affordability, especially when we think about electricity, which is the energy source we want people to choose over other energy sources when it comes to fossil fuel combustion types of fuels. So, we're working on our piece, doing our work. We'll announce that publicly when we're ready to do it. And then this is all with the backdrop of the conversation going on between the administration and the legislature on extension, which we think also is a big part of that certainty for investment. I actually think the extension piece is a bigger deal than the regulation, just because we're in it for the long game, and that gives you that long-term political certainty on the program, where we can, we've had AB 32, and during that time and up to 2016 when AB 398 came in to extend the program past 2020, we had amended the program 3 or 4 times through the regulatory process to reflect updates, new information. But what was always necessary was to have that long-term signal, because we are in it for the long haul. We've been in it for the long haul for 20 years now, and that's what we're going to be doing as we move forward. And we want to make sure that all those pieces are lined up.
Yeah, it may seem like there's exciting things happening on a day-to-day basis, but in reality, the trajectory is very steady. It has been, as you said, for a very long time.
Very deliberate, very strategic.
I remember when we first launched the program, and there was quite a bit of excitement around the launch, and I kept telling people in the governor's office and elsewhere that my goal was for it to be as boring as possible. And we pretty much succeeded in terms of the general public. I think if you asked people about the California Cap and Trade Program, they would probably not know what you were talking about, and for good reason, because it doesn't really become an exciting news day when we have an auction.
Well, the funny thing is, yes, you did say, I want it to be as boring as possible, but on the inside it wasn't boring, because we felt all this pressure to make sure we didn't screw something up.
Right.
Because like Justin was saying—
It wasn't boring for you.
It wasn't boring for you. Like Justin said, we were working through this, Waxman Markey was coming out there, and we're like, oh, we're never gonna have to implement these things. And all of a sudden it's the first auction, we're like, oh, I guess we're really implementing this thing.
We're doing it.
And we get through the first auction and we come out, and I remember Steve Cliff and I going, oh, the power's still on. That's a good sign.
Yes, well, we knew the risks that were involved in it, but I am very proud of the fact that the program has really operated all those years very smoothly without any scandals, any enforcement issues, and it just worked. And I know how much effort went into making that happen at the front end, and still does, into actually operating it as a successful market. It's true for Reggie. It's going to be true for the state of Washington. It is already true for the state of Washington's program as well, is that it takes competent people who are public servants to actually make these programs work, in addition to competent partners from the private sector, of course, as well. Okay, we've got a little bit more time if there are any. I don't see hands wildly waving in the air.
hands
There's a few. Okay.
Hi, Vijayatha from Carbon Pulse. I was wondering on LCFS if you're planning to have the regulations out by the Q1 reporting deadline still.
So we're focused on making sure that we are responsive to the issues that OAL provided. And as soon as we're able to submit it to OAL, that will give us a sense of how long it takes them to review and have those enrolled. So I can't speak to a specific date because it's not solely dependent on CARB.
An agency that most people weren't aware of has had a big
OAL.
impact on
Yes.
what's happening now, because the Office of Administrative Law, which was created as part of a backstop of in a very deregulatory moment in California's government, really for the first time decided to reject an ARB regulation, and with very little warning. So that was definitely a shock, I think, for those of us who have followed the program over all these years. But in fact, the objections that they raised are things that they're all procedural. They have no substantive role in deciding whether a regulation is a good idea or whether they agree with the objective, because that's the legislature's job, and the governor's job is to direct how the policy is going to play out. So it's really all procedural issues, but they're very important procedural issues because they provide protections for stakeholders, and they need to be observed. So I've been following this particular episode myself with some interest, because it does provide the opportunity for CARB to show that they understand and can deal with these what may seem like very petty legalistic arguments if you're not deeply into the weeds of administrative law. But administrative law really is the foundation for all of this work that we do. So I just want to really backstop or underscore what Rajinder is saying about the attention that's being paid to getting this issue resolved effectively.
We will be changing every may that was tagged to something more certain like shall or must, or removing it entirely. May was the issue. The word may came up multiple times.
Making use of those word search programs.
Exactly. Yes.
As a person who went from the legislative body to the executive body, that's probably one of the things that I've done different in writing bills, is be more specific and pedantic, candidly.
Right. Thank you. Okay, we probably have one or two
There's one
more.
more up front.
Oh, there's, yeah. I have light right in my face.
Hi, this is, my question is about this is for California, but the other states can also address. So California passed legislation requiring companies above a certain size to start reporting on their greenhouse gases, and that's been landing in ARB's lap. But I'm a little unsure now what's going on with that. So could you update us, because that's part of the conversation here at this meeting as well, is what's going on that?
So that's
Maybe
SB.
taking something away from the next speaker's presentation, but I don't know.
I can just give an update. So SB 253, SB 261, and then 219 are the GHG reporting laws, and then the corporate climate disclosure laws. They were signed into law by the governor. CARB is implementing those. We are hiring up staff. Last December, we put out a list of questions to help gather information as part of our work ahead of any regulatory proposal development. So we are moving forward and implementing those statutes.
Yeah, this is another example of states filling a gap, because I think if the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, had moved forward as they were once proposing to do on a comprehensive national reporting requirement, there would not have been a need for the states, and I don't think even California would have decided that they wanted their own, essentially duplicative program. But there was a big gap. The federal government decided not to proceed to really move forward on a reporting rule that would have taken us into the full realm of dealing with emissions beyond the most immediate direct emissions from a company, which are already reported in most cases quite adequately anyway. So this is once again an opportunity for the state to break new ground. And I know there are quite a few organizations that are in the reporting space and have their own methodologies, and there are registries involved that are all wanting to participate. CARB has had an open request out for comments on how to do the rulemaking, which is, I don't know how many pages you've received as of yet, but there's a lot.
Great to look.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Plenty. But I would be interested from my other colleagues here in any comments that you have in terms of your views about the importance of, or not, I suppose, of getting this kind of reporting going and getting it done in a way that's usable by everybody, as transparent. Do you think it's really going to make a difference in terms of actually achieving emissions reduction?
So I think one of the downfalls for the RGGI states of only doing electric generation, I know it was easy at the time, it was a heavily regulated sector, it was the regulated energy source. We knew everything about it. It was easy to measure. That left what is sort of colloquially called the unregulated fuels, which is all these other fuels, which the purveyors of those would probably argue are fairly heavily regulated, but in this instance, not particularly. And so it's become a barrier for the New York Cap and Invest program, for instance, and for Vermont as looking at it for their clean heat standard is what is even out there? What's happening there? How do we measure that? Who are the players? There's big gaps in that data set, and fuel in the Northeast is a complicated thing. It arrives from Canada, from overseas, into northern New England. It comes from Portland, Maine, Montreal, Albany, New York, New Jersey, by rail, by truck, by barge. It comes, in Vermont's case, sometimes into the state and then out of the state and then back into the state. So there's a lot of questions to be worked out there. And the first thing that states are trying to do is say, well, what is the universe of what we're talking about here? Who has control of it? Where does it go? And what does all that mean for emissions measuring and accounting? So I think we will see a lot more work on that in the next few years. New York is likely to come out with a reporting rule, not the whole Cap and Invest program, but certainly the reporting piece later this year. And that will be the start of a trend, I think, in the Northeast.
And I know Washington has had its issues as a major exporting and importing state around things like coal terminals, and how you account for that is also a question mark. So anything happening there?
Well, it's funny, that was actually one of my last bills that I did not get to finish off. We were paying close attention to how that GHG categorization was going to happen. We had some initial conversations around even that infrastructure. So we're following the lead of California. The federal level was planning on acting. So we felt that we can get some of that information there without having to reduplicate that work. Obviously, that is a different conversation now.
Thanks. We're counting down. We have a little clock here. We're very close to the end of the time for this panel. I want to say maybe a wrap-up comment myself, which is that I think a lot of what you have heard here today is really illustrative of what we started off talking about at the beginning about the role of states, which is what we do is we keep on doing what we're doing. I know every day that anything of ours has not been repealed or acted on at the federal level is a good day. And there's a lot of things that are pending or threatened that have not actually been acted on, which is always a good thing. But in addition to that, what you see is that states just keep on doing what they're doing. They're committed. Many of our states have very strong histories and records now of acting on climate, and they're going to continue maybe tinkering with their programs, but also looking at new ways to do things to achieve the results which are important to us, because each of us has a very precious resource of our lands and our people that we want to protect for the future. And part of that is making sure that we're taking action in the areas that we have responsibility for to protect that legacy and carry it forward. So if you're not already paying attention to what's going on in Vermont and Washington and California and many other states that were not included here, you should be following them through some of the wonderful reporters that are out there that are keeping track of all of us. So with that, I really want to thank everybody who's here today. You are obviously our partners in making this happen, and wish you all a successful continuation of this conference, and look forward to hearing from our state leader, Leanne Randolph, who's next up on the agenda. Thanks very much.